Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's very special edition of Lunch Bites with Steve and Jane. My name is Samuel Holliday, and I'm the Director of Operations and Scholarship at the United States Capitol Historical Society, and I'm so glad you were able to join us for this fascinating discussion. So without further ado, I encourage you to grab a drink, and I'll introduce our President of the United States Capitol Historical Society, Jane Campbell, to kick things off. Jane?
Thank you so much, Sam. I must admit it's a little early in the day. I only have coffee in my mug, but Garrett has provided wonderful recipes for cocktails in his book. So over the course of the time, we're going to learn about this book, and you might get it. It's a fun read and has cocktail recipes. Who knew? So before we get into today's presentation, I want to add my thanks to Sam for the technical support he provides and for the leadership he provides to the Society as our Director of Scholarship. These webinar series we began soon after we all got locked down, and we have been doing it in a manner to try to provide some scholarly content and some fun content. Today is a fun content, but also with a scholarly angle to it. This is a series that we've been calling Lunch Bites with Steve and Jane. If you've missed some of them, you can go back on our website and see. We've been exploring with Steve Livengood, our chief tour guide, the Capitol Hill neighborhood, how it came to be, what the history is. So now let's talk about today's special guest. Garrett Peck is an author, public historian, and a tour guide in the nation's capital. He leads tours through the Smithsonian Associates, and his Temperance tour has been featured on the C-SPAN Book TV and the History Channel program. He was featured in a 2-hour documentary about Prohibition put on by the Smithsonian Channel. He researched and pinpointed the Washington Brewery at Navy Yard, and he's especially proud that Green Hat Jim is named for a character Peck wrote about in Prohibition in Washington, D.C. So we're going to hear about the man with the green hat, which is a fun story. He's lectured at the Library of Congress, the National Archives, the Smithsonian, and is a real joy that we have him here today. As I was getting ready for this, I was sharing with Sam, my own family history has been on both sides of this issue. My great-grandmother was a member of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and my grandfather that's on my mother's side, and on my father's side, my grandfather was a bootlegger. So we got the whole thing going on. But as is always the way in Washington, there's the story about what happened in politics and what happened in reality. So Garrett, tell us, how dry were we during Prohibition?
Not very. So, but thank you, Jane. So thank you so much here for the introduction here. And that's so fabulous here hearing about your family history. So it's all too often those stories go unrecorded, or it's just on a family lore and so on, because people, of course, they were breaking the law in the 1920s and early 1930s, and therefore they didn't particularly want to write this stuff down. But it's such fascinating family history, and I love coming into contact with families who do know what their family history is about. So let me share my screen here, and we'll kick our fun discussion off here today. So yes, I published this book here called Prohibition in Washington, D.C., subtitle How Dry We Weren't. So it is scholarly written and researched, and yet you can tell from the subtitle that I use a fair amount of irony throughout the book, because it was sort of like, what were they thinking? How is Prohibition ever going to work in a city that, from the beginning, and for an American culture that has always been a wet culture? We always have been. And so it's just so fascinating. This year, by the way, in particular, we are marking 2 centennial editions of constitutional amendments. So just 2 days ago, of course, we commemorated, and I think celebrated, the centennial of women earning the right to vote through the 19th Amendment. But the beginning of 2020 was the centennial of the beginning of Prohibition, which was January 16th. Yeah, so you've got the 18th and 19th Amendments go into effect that year. That is not an historical anomaly or anything. This happens because there is an alliance, a progressive alliance that makes both of these things happen that year. So it's pretty important. Now, talking about prohibition in DC itself, why this particular city? Why does it matter? And really, even though this is a local story, and yet, of course, it has national ramifications, because what happens in DC gets reported on nationwide. And so it's so interesting that Congress intended for DC to be the, quote, model dry city for the rest of the country. But in fact, we ended up having about 3,000 speakeasies, and Congress employed its own bootleggers during this time. We'll learn about one of them here today, a very, very famous bootlegger named George Cassidy, better known as the man in the green hat. So I'm going to kind of focus my talk. It does cover the entire city, but because this is the U.S. Capitol Historical Society, so a lot of this is going to be about what happened on Capitol Hill and the areas around, there's a whole neighborhood, a wonderful neighborhood in the city surrounding the U.S. Capitol. So I've got 5 maps in the book, and here's the map here for Capitol Hill showing you where many of the shenanigans took place. The book does in fact have 80 images in it, so you'll see a number of them here today, and 11 vintage cocktail recipes. I'll show you one of them, the Scofflaw, a little bit later on. It's a word that was invented in 1924. So how did we get prohibition? What was the origin of all this? And the quick answer to that was the Temperance Movement. Now, most Americans don't recall the Temperance Movement. The word temperance itself culturally has largely left our vocabulary, kind of like the gold standard or communism. It's just not really part of our cultural vocabulary anymore. But it once was a very powerful social reform movement of the 19th century, and ultimately that gave us the 18th Amendment, the Prohibition Amendment, that banned the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol. What you're looking at here is something, if you live in DC, I swear to God, you have walked past this statue. It has been referred to by one US senator as the ugliest statue in all of DC. And what this is the Cogswell Temperance Fountain. And this is at 7th Street at Pennsylvania Avenue. So right across from Archives Navy Memorial Metro Station. And where you see the fireman building, the one with the gold cupola, at the base of it, there's a Starbucks. So in kind of catty corner that way is the National Archives. It's right there. So I swear to God, you've all walked past it. You just haven't really noticed it because it's pretty ugly and it doesn't really speak anymore to our cultural traditions. But yeah, temperance was a huge force. And in fact, you go inside the Library of Congress, and there's those beautiful frescoes that are painted all around there. You will see among all the different virtues that are painted, there's a temperance virtue. And there's a close-up photo of it there. And you might notice the woman is very much done like in ancient Rome, like the frescoes done in Pompeii and Herculaneum, where you sort of have these floating figures. And notice that she's pouring out water instead of wine. And this is because in the temperance movement of the 19th century, they basically seized upon that there was no safe level, they believed, for anyone to drink alcohol at all. And therefore, for them, temperance didn't mean moderate drinking. It meant abstaining from alcohol. And thus you see this allegorical figure pouring out water into the drinking cup rather than wine, which is actually what the ancient Romans and ancient Greeks drank and so on. So I just think that's so fascinating that it's right there in the Library of Congress. And these were painted here in the 1890s, right as the temperance movement was reaching the peak of its political fame and fortune. In the U.S. Capitol itself, very prominent statue in Statuary Hall. The first woman to ever get a statue in Statuary Hall is Frances Willard of Illinois. Now, why is she so important? She was this progressive leader who led the Women's Christian Temperance Union for 20 years. So really remarkable woman. The WCTU took on this ethic of what they called, quote, do everything. So very strong progressive organization. And this was largely about protecting women and the family from domestic violence from alcohol. And really remarkable. I mean, I don't personally agree with her about the alcohol thing, but we still really have to have a huge amount of respect for her because this is still an age before women had to vote. And so they found other ways to lobby to get women's voices to be heard around the family and women's rights. So really remarkable. Another key person we're going to talk about is Wayne Wheeler. So the WCTU got in the classrooms, they tried to educate children, especially Protestant children in learning how to be ashamed of alcohol. And certainly I saw that with my own grandmother, who was born in 1913. And she was raised with this ethic of, well, if anyone sees you drinking, they'll think that you're a drunk. And so therefore you kept it on the down low. So no small amount of hypocrisy there among American Protestants. Catholics never had that issue, by the way. But the WCTU, again, women did not have the right to vote yet. And so all they could do was lobby and try to influence and so on. But in 1893, there was a new organization founded in Ohio called the Anti-Saloon League. And right out of Oberlin College, they hired a young man named Wayne Wheeler, who moved to DC in 1916 to be the legislative superintendent, i.e. lobbyist, for the ASL. And the ASL, unfortunately, for better or for worse, most people have never heard of this organization. And they existed from 1893 to 1933, and then effectively went out of business because they were blamed for prohibition. They were the ones who got the 18th Amendment passed. This man, Wayne Wheeler, was so powerful. I mean, the ASL was probably the most powerful lobbying organization in our nation's history. He invented the term, quote, pressure politics, because he figured out how to squeeze the politicians. And by leveraging the minority, his minority votes that he could cast either way in an election, and that minority vote were the evangelical Protestant ministers. And so he was very bipartisan. He basically forced all the Democrats and Republicans to vote dry or else. And of course, a politician's first job is to get reelected. So if someone didn't toe the line, he would guarantee that they would not get reelected. And he was really quite powerful. And again, he's the one who oversees the 18th Amendment getting through Congress in 1917. Another key person here for our story is a progressive senator from Texas named Morris Shepherd. And why is he so important? Well, he's the one who leads the charge for the 18th Amendment in the Senate, the Prohibition Amendment. And in addition, for those of you who are fans of home rule in DC, well, DC had no home rule at this point. And he therefore passes what's called the Shepherd Act. This is during World War I, declaring that DC at midnight on October 31st, 1917 is hereby a dry city. DC had no vote in this. Congress simply just mandated it because effectively it was a feudal domain of Congress. And so DC went dry with that against public will. And there were 267 licensed saloons in the city that all had to shut down that night. And that meant that several thousand people lost their jobs on November 1st. So remarkable. We're going to come back to Morris Shepherd a little bit later on because he's still in the picture and during the repeal battle. So remember that name, Morris Shepherd. All right, so DC, again, goes dry on November 1st, 1917. And what that means is that all the breweries instantly have to shut down. And by the way, what's going on is World War I. This is a key reason how the Anti-Saloon League managed to push its message forward, because the biggest ethnic group in the country at the time were the Germans. We just declared war against Germany. And of course, the German Americans were also the brewers. So they were the biggest obstacle in the country against the forces of temperance. In and around the DC area, there were 6 major breweries, 2 on Capitol Hill, 2 in Foggy Bottom, and 1 each in Arlington and Alexandria. I'll show you the 2 here in Capitol Hill. So this here is the National Capital Brewing Company, and quite a large facility. It could produce about 100,000 barrels of beer per year. And during Prohibition itself, it became a dairy. The Meadow Gold Dairy Company produced ice cream. And that lasted till 1964. And then it became a Safeway. And that Safeway is now just recently has been torn down and is now in the process of being redeveloped as a community center. So that's over on 14th Street Southeast, so not too far away from Congressional Cemetery. Another Capitol Hill brewery was the Washington Brewery. By the way, we had 6 breweries in our history, in the city's history, that went by the name Washington Brewery. We don't actually have one right now, go figure. But this was another very large brewery, and it shut down also in 1917. And it is today the site of Stuart Hobson Middle School. So it's a very, very large, like 2-block facility. And you see, if you go by that school, you'll see how big that school is. And that was how large this particular brewery was. But all those were shut down. No one was ever compensated for the fact that they lost their business in this. We simply just changed the Constitution, and all these business owners had to figure out what else to do with their property. And meanwhile, they still had to go pay the property taxes and so on. So the 18th Amendment here, for those of you who like to read the Constitution. So here is the first portion of it. And by the way, this was ratified on January 16th, 1919, which meant it went to effect exactly 1 year later. This is really seen as a wartime measure. You know, they got the amendment passed in late 1917 through Congress, and it went on to the states and was ratified in only 13 months. That's incredible. A constitutional amendment ratified in 13 months. This is largely because of World War I. And everyone was thinking, oh yeah, it's our patriotic duty. We gotta like have a sober soldiers so they can go fight the German army. Even though the German army, of course, was feeding beer to their soldiers, as was the French army with wine and gin, and the British army as well. So alcohol was always a tradition for soldiers. But part of the propaganda on the American side was, you know, we need this to win the war effort, and we got to save all that grain so we can go beat the Germans. So here's what the actual wording of the 18th Amendment says. After 1 year from the ratification of this article, and I put it in bold here, the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors, ... is hereby prohibited. What do you not see on there? No mention of banning personal possession, right? Because the ASL, the Anti-Saloon League, understood it would not be popular. It would make it harder to sell. They were very naive to think that Americans would simply just drink up whatever they had stockpiled at home, and after that, they would just go dry. Yeah, like that was going to work out. That's what they believed. But very quickly, the bootleggers, like the Campbells, started Jane, started showing up and started bootlegging to supply the market. So, yeah, the way I look at it is kind of like an economist. You know, you have, if you remember this from like Econ 101, you've got a supply curve and a demand curve, and all this is really addressing here is the supply side of the equation. And all you're trying to do is take away the supply, but without really ever addressing the demand side. You know, why do Americans want to drink? So, and if there's still that demand, well, guess what? Someone's going to find a way to supply it. That's just market economics. And very quickly, the bootleggers start stepping up and supplying the market to Americans' high demand to drink alcohol. I should mention here as well, and I love this photo, they had to pass enabling legislation to enforce prohibition. So yeah, you've got this 18th Amendment, but you also have to have a law that defines, for example, what is intoxicating liquors, and which is defined as anything lower than 0.5% alcohol. It's incredible. So you can't even have near beer at this moment. There are quite a number of loopholes. For example, sacramental wine, and very famously, you've heard of this one, I'm sure, medicinal whiskey. So widely abused all throughout the states here during Prohibition. The person though who got this law passed, he was the head of the House Judiciary Committee, and his name was Andrew Volstead from Minnesota. So he was I think he was a Norwegian descent. And of course, it's Andrew Volstead and his mustache. It's quite an impressive push-broom mustache he has. He was rather discredited by this law, the Volstead Act, and lost his seat in Congress within a couple of years. But yeah, it was his job just to get this law passed, and then of course he gets blamed for it afterwards, and all throughout history, of course. So I think he was kind of a moderate drinker himself. All right, I love this photo. This is actually on the cover of the book. So, but on January 16th at midnight, the midnight meeting leading to January 17th, this is when Prohibition nationwide begins. And you see here this really cool photo of Georgia Congressman William Upshaw. Notice what he's doing. He's holding this umbrella over the U.S. Capitol. So it's highly symbolic. He's basically saying, we as congressmen are now dry. Anyone here think that Congress was ever dry? If you do, I got a bridge in Nebraska. Sorry, I got some beachfront property in Nebraska, I can tell you, because Congress never went dry. So other than like William Upshaw and a handful of senators, but by and large, the congressmen were still drinking. So no small amount of hypocrisy there. So even though we had banned alcohol from our country, the manufacture, sale, and transportation of it. And of course, we'd gotten 36 plus states. And by the way, ultimately, it was 46 out of the 48 states did ratify the constitutional amendment. Only 2 states did not, which is pretty incredible. And those states, by the way, had a heavy Catholic population, and those were Connecticut and Rhode Island. So 2 New England states and the Catholics in the country understood that prohibition in so many ways was targeted at them. It was in part a nativist movement. And of course, we were going through this huge wave of immigration, and overwhelmingly, the people coming into the country were Catholics. So the Protestants of the country felt like, gosh, we're about to be overthrown by all these Catholics. And so we need to do something culturally to basically get them to conform, because of course the Catholics never had theological issues with alcohol. And therefore they came over, the Irish, the Germans, the Czechs, the Russians, and so on. They all brought, and the Italians, of course, they all brought their drinking habits with them. So you do have to really question, because we got the 18th Amendment essentially ratified largely during World War I, was there actually a national consensus about banning alcohol? I don't have a definitive answer, but I think the answer is probably no. Most people simply thought this was what we needed to do to win the war. And in addition, they really thought they were voting to ban liquor, meaning distilled spirits, but they still thought that like beer and light wine would be legal. When in fact, come January 17th, they woke up and it's like, oh, you took away our beer? I mean, this was the national beverage, and suddenly we can't drink beer anymore? People were really stunned by that. And so Wayne Wheeler had his work cut out, because the congressmen started complaining to him about the fact that they had taken away the nation's beer. So prohibition itself lasts nearly 16 years in DC. However, nationwide, as H.L. Mencken, the Bard of Baltimore, calls it, the, quote, 13 awful years. In fact, it lasts nearly 14 years, but I just love that line. And I quote throughout my book, I quote Mencken all the time because he's such a wonderful crank. So he really is quite funny. So, and he was an atheist. He understood the Temperance Movement, what it was. In essence, this was an evangelical movement designed to make Americans better people. And he generally cast askance really at reform movements like this, because he really understood it really kind of violates human nature, trying to improve people rather than just trying to improve their circumstances. So he, very interestingly enough, right before Prohibition started, he had an electric car that he sold, and filled up his, where he lived in Baltimore, he filled up the cellar full of alcohol with the proceeds. And then discovered within about 4 months that there were so many bootleggers already out there offering beer and liquor and so on, or as he called them, booticians. So I just love Mencken. And again, I quote from him throughout the story quite a bit. So one of those people who decided he was not going to obey prohibition, and certainly encouraged other people not to. I found this remarkable quote. In the 1920s, there's so much great literature. You've got the Lost Generation, so Hemingway, Fitzgerald, and so on. And of course, the bad boy of them all, I think Mencken called him the Red Devil, the Red Tornado from the Minnesota Plains, and that was Sinclair Lewis. So one of the great satirists in American history. And in 1922, Lewis was living in DC on DuPont Circle. And he wrote his great novel called Babbitt, for which he won the Nobel Prize in 1930. And in this novel, he's got this scene, it's incredible. He basically explains why Prohibition is going to fail. So this is only 2 years into Prohibition, this quote. And the setting, if you've ever read Babbitt, it's a really great satirical novel. And in the setting, you sort of have this anti-hero, George Babbitt, and he is going on a fishing trip, and he's in a railway car. And an unnamed man pulls out a flask of gin and passes it around, and this guy makes this statement, quote, "I don't know how you fellows feel about prohibition, but the way it strikes me is that it's a mighty beneficial thing for the poor zob that hasn't got any willpower. But for fellows like us, it's an infringement of personal liberty." So you see right there, 1922, why and how Lewis has captured why prohibition is going to fail. Because prohibition is something for everyone else to obey, you and you and you, but not me. I can handle my liquor, and I still enjoy my cocktail, and I'm going to keep drinking. In a nutshell, that's it. That's why it's going to fail, because everyone says they're not going to obey the law of the land. So yeah, just remarkable. And already by the 1920s, Americans are developing relationships with bootleggers and so on. So it's a remarkable little story there with Sinclair Lewis, an author who is worth reading again. He has such a great satirical voice to his writing. I'm going to show you a couple different photos here of Prohibition here in the nation's capital. I've got a whole bunch more in the book. These largely come out of the Library of Congress. I love this one here showing the, quote, largest still in captivity. This is early on in Prohibition, I think 1921, 1922. They would capture much larger stills over time. But most of the stills and most of the speakeasies we had in DC were actually in people's homes. So people would put up a very small still like in their bathroom. And you could go buy the equipment, for example, at the hardware store. And then once a week, your local bootlegger would come around and collect the supplies that you had produced for him and give you cash money for it, untaxed. So there were so many people getting involved in this game because there was so much money to be made. Of course, you're also putting your house in danger because anytime you put a still somewhere, there's going to be combustion. And so there are more than a few stills that catch fire or blow up. And so there's always that danger. In this case here, I think this is so interesting. They have a still in the backyard because it's probably too big for a house. And which means that, and by the way, if you've ever been around a distillery, it smells. You will smell it. You'll smell both when they have to produce the beer that then has to be distilled. Then of course you smell the raw alcohol as it comes off of it. And you're like, woo, you've heard that phrase, like, geez, you smell like a still. Guess where that comes from? Stills kind of stink. They smell like alcohol. So yeah, the Prohibition Bureau, backed up by the Metropolitan Police Department of DC, had its job in for them because, again, there were about 3,000 speakeasies and estimated 4,000 to 4,500 people in DC who were operating as bootleggers during Prohibition. Also, I love this photo. This is one of the most famous photos that comes from Prohibition itself. This is actually in the Federal Triangle. And this is the Carl Hamill Buffet lunch. So basically a lunch cafe, and very typical for a speakeasy in DC. You've got a legitimate business up front, and then a little back room, a dark room as they called it, in the back. And if you knew someone, you could say the password or, hey, I want to talk to Bill. And they let you in the back, and then you can go get a drink of beer in the back. And this place here got raided 3 times. So here they are. You can tell they're pulling out the beer barrels out of the cellar of the Carl Hamill lunchroom. This site here, by the way, that's if you see the address right there, 922 Pennsylvania Avenue. If you look that up on Google Maps, that is the site of the Department of Justice today. So no small irony there. All right. Fascinating story here involving Senator Frank Greene of Vermont. We largely did not have a lot of violence in DC. We didn't really have a lot of organized crime. We had lots of disorganized crime. But we never had like the Italian mafia or the Irish mob or anything. So it was largely a bunch of amateur bootleggers getting involved in the action. And not too much violence, a few shootouts here and there. And there was one shootout, though, involving Senator Greene. He was a passerby walking up Pennsylvania Avenue, right at the base of Capitol Hill by Judiciary Square. And right by where the courthouses are, there was a bootlegger operating. And the Metropolitan Police Department, together with the Prohibition Bureau, were getting ready to raid these bootleggers operating there, and the Prohibition agent opened fire. And this is right as Senator Greene and his wife were walking past, and the bullet missed the bootlegger and hit Senator Greene instead. So he became an unintended casualty of Prohibition violence. And as I said, there was not that much violence in DC itself, but this was really a shame for Senator Greene. He was seriously injured by this and was in the hospital and out of action for quite a number of months here. But eventually he did make his way back into the Senate. If you go to Capitol Hill, there's a very famous dive bar on Pennsylvania Avenue known as Tunin. It was not open as a dive bar during Prohibition. It was instead a candy store. However, what they did, they used out of the basement, they had a little ladder going down, and out of the basement, they sold liquor. So, and the little ladders, the access to the basement is right behind the cash register, even to this day. And so if a customer came in and said, hey, I want a pound of something, a little code word for, I want a fifth of gin. And then they wrap it up your purchase and give it to you. And then Tunin itself opened up in 1947. And you look on the menu and they say, I don't know how they would ever determine this, but they say that they are the second business in the city to get a license. The number one, that one is actually categorized. That's the National Press Club. That was in early 1934. It just happened on the night they gave out all the licenses. There were 200 of them. The National Press Club got the very first one, of course, because that was a press opportunity. And then the police drove around the city that morning and dropped off the rest. So I don't know how Tunin can claim they're number two. Maybe they aren't, but most likely, maybe they are, but most likely they aren't, because it's probably impossible to determine who got number two, number three, number four, because the police were just running around the city dropping off all the licenses. But it's pretty cool. That's on their menu. They do mention this at the restaurant. Because we're at these two major anniversaries here for Prohibition and suffrage, so let's talk about women in Prohibition. And this is a photo here from a court-martial that took place at Navy Yard. These two women nurses wearing man's hats were formerly stationed in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, at the U.S. Naval installation there. And they got transferred up to the Washington Navy Yard. And Customs looked through their suitcases and found bottles of rum. So the Secretary of the Navy demanded that these two women be court-martialed. The officer corps largely covered for them. And they were like, look, they're doing what everyone else is doing. Basically, you get transitioned from one post back to the U.S. Everyone's bootlegging alcohol back, And so the defense basically said, all they had to do essentially do was plead, hey, we were given these bottles as gifts. We didn't know what they were. We just put them in our suitcases. And of course, they were found not guilty. The officer corps was not going to find guilty some of their own sailors for doing something that everyone else was doing. But the Secretary of Navy, of course, was trying to make a point out of, even a symbolic point out of these two nurses. And the officer corps was not going to have this. So I think that's kind of cool. In addition, here's a really cool photo, and I'll give you a cocktail recipe here from the book. But this is a young woman who was actually a dancer at Keith's Vaudeville Theater, which is where the Old Ebbitt Grill is today, over there on 15th Street near the White House. And this word, this scofflaw, was actually invented in 1924. There was a Harvard graduate named Delsaver King who was so upset at seeing all the drinking that was going on at his alma mater, Harvard University. And so he sponsored a nationwide competition to come up with a word to name those lawbreakers. It had to start with the letter S. And two people submitted the winning entry, which was the word scofflaw. It's an ingenious word. So this word was invented in 1924 on the 4th anniversary of National Prohibition, meaning someone who scoffs at the law. 1 week later, in Harry's bar in Paris, the Scofflaw Cocktail was invented. And this is in my book, and it is a delicious little number. Like, oh my God, this is one of my all-time favorite cocktails. It is really fantastic. The secret ingredients is the grenadine, real grenadine, which is easy to make. I wouldn't buy that Rose's stuff. It's way too sweet. But you can actually make your own grenadine with simple syrup and some like Palm Wonderful pomegranate juice, and 50-50 blend. And there you go. You got grenadine. Super simple. And it's a delicious cocktail. So give it a try sometime. All right, as the nation was really debating, especially as Prohibition went on, as there was so much law-breaking going on, and then, of course, with the Great Depression, the onset of the Great Depression, we lost so many jobs. So by 1930, much of the nation was calling for an end of Prohibition. And you remember that name, Senator Morris Shepherd? Well, he was sort of the Stonewall in Congress, basically saying, we are not going to repeal the 18th Amendment. And in September 1930, he made this very famous statement, which I'll read to you here. It's up on the screen. There is as much chance of repealing the 18th Amendment as there is for a hummingbird to fly to the planet Mars with the Washington Monument tied to its tail. Well, that sounds like an invitation, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. And boy, howdy, did the wet cause strike back. Amazing. So first off, there's this guy named Rufus Lusk. Here he is. For those of you who are longtime Washingtonians, you might remember the Lusk real estate papers. So this guy was a data guy. He was an Irishman who fought as a captain in the U.S. infantry in World War I and was Catholic and was very much opposed to the Temperance Movement and to Prohibition. His family here, by the way, is still here in the D.C. area. They provided this photo here for me. And he, being a real estate and above all a data person, he decided he was going to embarrass the dry cause by showing how wet DC was. So he really wanted to show that DC was failing as this, quote, model dry city. And so he put all these data points from police raids on a map using 7 months of 1929 data. And that had over 900 points of data, just incredible. And this made not just national news, this went global, incredible, by effectively creating a graphic showing how effective this was. He then did it again 2 years later, and I found this one here in the Library of Congress, the original. So it was really cool. So I'm going to show you the one that was produced in 1932. And this is such a clever piece of propaganda. It's just jaw-dropping. So are you guys ready for this? This is so cool. This is based on 1931 police data. Dots mark the spot where booze has been bought. Do you see all the dots all over there? That marks 1,155 places where the police and Prohibition Bureau raided and found alcohol. That's incredible. In addition, there were also about 600 raids where they found no alcohol at all, and those did not go on the map. This is really incredible. You might look at some of the details that are on this map. For example, there are a couple stars that are kind of in the middle, right kind of below the U.S. Capitol. Those are federal buildings where raids took place. You'll see as well, very, very cleverly, he put things up here like the Anti-Saloon League headquarters, which is where Robert Taft Park is, so right across from the U.S. Capitol. He put the Methodist building, which is right across from the Supreme Court, the Women's Christian Temperance Union headquarters, and around all these buildings, you'll see all these little dots because all around the city, there were raids taking place. So just, he really wanted to show that DC was not a wet city, sorry, not a dry city at all. And he did his part really to undermine the dry cause. 1 month later, the Washington Post got one of its greatest scoops. I think probably the greatest scoop they ever got was Watergate, along with the Pentagon Papers. But this was a great scoop on its own in that they got the main bootlegger for Congress to come forward and tell his story. That man's name was George Cassidy. Here is a picture of him, better known as the man in the green hat. And there you see his hat there in the background. And he was the main bootlegger for Congress for 10 years, starting in 1920. He got arrested in 1925. And after that, he spent a short period in jail. And after that, he shifted over. And by the way, he worked in the Canon House office building. And they gave him an office in the basement because that way he could supply the alcohol directly to the congressmen, and also gave them a place to come and play cards and whatnot. He had such a great personality that the congressman loved hanging out with George. And after his first arrest, though, he shifted over to the Russell Senate office building because senators were more discreet. They tended to send their secretaries down to come collect the alcohol rather than coming down themselves. So, and then he's arrested for the second and final time in February of 1930. And the Washington Post approaches him, asking him, hey, would you like to write some stories about your experience as a bootlegger? And he says, yes, I would. So he publishes 6 front page articles for the Washington Post, just incredible. And of which the very last one ran 1 week before the midterm election of 1930. So the Washington Post by this point was a decidedly wet newspaper, and they were doing everything they could to discredit the dry cause. And yeah, then you saw this big midterm election in 1930. By the way, here's the Canon House office building. And you saw this huge flip in Congress then in 1930, largely because of the Great Depression, but also now most of the Democratic congressmen and even a few of the Republican congressmen who were elected are now openly wet candidates. Wet congressmen and senators. So there's now this growing wave calling for the end of prohibition. And yeah, ultimately this idealism of a dry nation shatters on hard reality, because in 1932, Franklin Roosevelt runs on the wet program. And before he's even sworn into office, he's the last president to be sworn in on March 4th. Before he's even sworn in, Congress has already passed the 21st Amendment, and it is on to the states. The very first state that ratifies it is Michigan, which is on April 10th. And then 8 months later, the state of Utah is the 36th state that puts it over the top. It's incredible. So yeah, a state which is mostly Mormon. Yeah, once you've lost the Mormons, it's kind of like game over. Even the Mormons were voting in favor of repeal because it just clearly prohibition was not working. So yeah, we count Repeal Day as December 5th, 1933, also known as Cinco de Drinko for the end of prohibition. However, prohibition did not end in DC because we did not have home rule. So DC actually ended prohibition on March 1st, 1934, because Congress had to then pass a law, and by which they created effectively a regulatory regime, the three-tier system, that the nation then copied, and it worked out fairly successfully. So we kind of put our stamp upon the nation as kind of a model wet city for the rest of the country. Kind of a cool story about this, and Jane mentioned this in my biography at the very, very beginning. But in 2012, the New Columbia Distillers opened up, and they wanted to have a local story behind their name. So they wanted to name their product after George Cassidy. So they approached me because they read about the story in my book, and I put them in contact then with Fred Cassidy, who is the man there you see in the middle, who is the son of George Cassidy, and he was over the moon over this idea. So the one thing he asked for, as you see here in the photo, is the first case of gin, which he then distributed to his family. So I went there, I took this photo myself. We had a little bottling party on that day, and it was a lot of fun. So New Columbia is over in Ivy City, which has kind of become this cool brewing and distilling district in DC. All right, last couple slides here, and we'll take some Q&A. But I completely off topic here, but I have a brand new book that came out in June called A Decade of Disruption, America and the New Millennium, 2000 to 2010. And you might feel like deja vu all over again because we are all living through this time of just absolutely massive disruption right now. Everyone in the world has had their lives disrupted. But yeah, it's a history of that first decade kind of squeezed in between the dot-com meltdown and then, of course, the Great Recession on the other hand. And then everything in between, from 9/11 to the Iraq War and the housing bubble and so on. So really cool book. I've written 8 books. This is my favorite book. It was a fun book to research and write. So it took me about 13 years to write this book. And this here is my last slide. So, hey, my lecture here today, my talk came out of both my book here, Prohibition in Washington, D.C., and then also wrote a chapter in my book, The Great War in America, called Prohibition Begins. So it gives you an opportunity to kind of put it in context of World War I and how they sold it to the American public. And with that, I want to thank you so much for coming here today. I want to thank Sam and Jane for supporting this. And especially I want to thank you, the audience, for giving up a little bit of your lunchtime here. And I'll be thrilled to take any questions that you might have. So Jane, take it away.
Garrett, what a great, you're an engaging speaker. I read the book, the Prohibition book. It's very engaging. So thank you so much for telling stories that we wouldn't have known otherwise. So we've got a couple of questions. One, you spoke about this a little bit, but the influence of the immigrants that were coming in right at the same time that Prohibition was going into effect, and we had Irish and Italians, and how did all that play in together?
Yeah, it is so interesting considering that the peak right before Prohibition starts, effectively, we have the highest number of immigrants in our society ever. It's about a third of Americans are either first generation or have a parent who was born overseas. Highest proportion ever in American society. And what happens in 1924, we pass this immigration law that slams the gate shut because people felt like culturally we were under threat by all these Eastern Europeans who were coming in. We basically walled ourselves off from anyone of Asian descent from coming into our country. I mean, the xenophobia was very strong in the country. The immigration, as you've seen over our history, it's really swung back and forth. And of course, we're kind of dealing with that question right now. We are really sorely overdue for another immigration reform bill, but it's hard to get any kind of collective will behind it. But certainly that was part of the Prohibition debate. There was a very strong nativist sentiment. The Protestants, who were kind of the dominant culture in the country, were seeing all these Catholics coming in, and in addition, these Eastern European, largely Russian Empire Jews, who were coming in as well, and they all brought their drinking habits with them. And so many of them, of course, thought these people can't be Americans. You know, they're Poles, they're Italians, and so on. You know, they're not assimilating. They speak that language they speak, and so on. And so hence we wanted to slam the gate shut to keep any more of them from coming in. So nativism was a big factor behind Prohibition. And there's a number of other factors as well. The Ku Klux Klan threw its weight behind it because it wanted to keep alcohol away from African Americans, and so on. So there's a whole, it's a coalition movement, each one with its own agenda behind it. But a lot of it was about cultural dominance and about trying to like keep the other groups under control, basically. And of course, it's all those same groups are the ones who are like, okay, fine, we're Catholic. Well, we're not going to obey this law. We're going to go ahead and bootleg anyway. So there, you know. So you see all kinds of bootlegging because of that, like from people named Campbell.
Well, no. What we say?
The Scots are long known for their bootlegging cultures, you know. So
yeah, what can I say? That's a situation.
Own it, you know.
Now, tell me, President Hoover, did he have a stance? You talked about President Roosevelt, but
yeah. So basically, during Prohibition, there are 5 presidents, from Wilson all the way to President Woodrow Wilson, all the way up to Franklin Roosevelt. The only one who really tried to enforce it was Herbert Hoover, and that really backfired because most of the public was quite sour on the idea of Prohibition. And he got Congress to pass a law known as the Jones 5 and 10 Act. And what that meant, and beforehand, people got kind of a slap on the wrist. You might have your business bootlegged for a year. You might pay a fine, but then you just reopen your business right afterwards. With the Jones 5 and 10 Act, that meant that you went to jail for 5 years and you paid a $10,000 fine, which was enormous. And so what happened, all these bootleggers who used to plead guilty, you know, they would just plea out and then pay their fine and go on back to being a bootlegger again. Everyone started demanding jury trials. And you can imagine how much this just gummed up the entire legal system. When every bootlegger suddenly, we're talking hundreds of thousands of people, is suddenly demanding a jury trial. You know, it's just incredible. So it really backfired. The public was already quite cynical at this point about it. And people were just like, this ain't working. You know, it's just, and by the way, by 1929, of course, you've heard about like the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Violence is growing greater across the country as the mafia and the mob are engaging in territorial warfare over turf. And so by 1930, the country is like, let's get this thing over with. It's not working. And so then you saw very prominent defectors like John D. Rockefeller Jr., who was a richest man in the country and a dry Baptist, who formally supported Prohibition and then was like, and he published a very prominent letter effectively denouncing it in 1932.
Interesting.
Yeah, poor Hoover. He gets blamed for a lot of stuff. It's not always his fault, like the Great Depression.
Yeah, he had a tough road.
Yeah, he did.
Now, in the beginning, when you were talking about what the enactment of Prohibition and what it did to the businesses, the bar owners, the employees who were bar workers, was there any attempt to compensate people for their loss of business, or was it just sorry about your luck?
The latter, basically. Yeah. I mean, we passed a constitutional amendment that basically took away the right to manufacture or to sell all this stuff. So all the business owners were just, as we say, SOL. So, for example, like the Christian Heinrich Brewing Company, so the biggest brewer in DC period, which is now the site of the Kennedy Center. And he actually stayed in business. He had just produced an ice plant. And this is the age of the ice box. So you got ice delivered to your house. And he complained about this in his memoir, like, okay, I couldn't produce beer anymore, but I still had to pay all these property taxes on this huge facility that he had. Many of the bar owners tried to convert into soft drink emporiums and very quickly learned no one was interested. If they couldn't have booze, the fans just stopped coming. You know, no one wanted to have soft drinks. They wanted to have a drink. And hence, pretty quickly, the bootleggers got onto this and people started buying it and drinking it at home or in illegal speakeasies.
Illegal. And so one of our listeners is particularly interested in the Heinrich Brewery, you know, which, as you say, is now the Kennedy Center.
Yeah.
How long did it last, and when did that transfer? Did it go directly from being the brewery to the Kennedy Center, or what was the, do you know the story of that?
Yeah. And actually, there's another book I wrote called Capital Beer, and it has a lot of Heinrich in there. So it's a history of brewing in the DC area. And Heinrich managed to reopen after Prohibition was over. And by the way, he lived till March of 1945. So he saw both World War I and the anti-German hysteria, and then saw World War II as well. He was 3 weeks shy of his 103rd birthday when he died. Incredible.
Wow.
He was like the Methuselah of brewing. And after Prohibition was over, though, what he saw, and he wrote this in his memoir, it was like, what happened to, before Prohibition started, everyone drank beer. Afterwards, people aren't drinking beer anymore. It's just the market just kind of evaporated. And that's in part because the bootleggers were bringing in distilled spirits because it was so concentrated and therefore so much higher profit for the bootleggers. And so the public got a taste of distilled spirits and producing cocktails, that kind of stuff. And so his market largely evaporated. So even when he reopened in 1934. And the brewery actually stayed open until 1956. It just kind of trudged along. And by that point, sales were just gently on the downhill slope. The federal government wanted the land by that point, and the family agreed that they would sell the land to the federal government. However, the brewery facility still stood for another 5 years. They didn't blow them up until 1961. So, which is kind of cool. And a cool little side note here. In that 5-year period, there was a very famous local stage, famous today, that opened up and used the brewing facilities as their stage. And they called the stage, they called it the Old Vat. And there's actually a photo I found. I couldn't produce it because we couldn't determine who owns the rights of it. But the actual stage was Arena Stage. That's where they started, was in the brewery. And today, of course, they're down in Southwest, right there right by the waterfront. But that's where they got their start, in the Heinrich Brewing Company. Pretty cool.
Well, this is great. And Garrett, you have been so generous with your time and your talent. And
happy to.
We hope to, have you back again on another matter, because you're fun to talk to, and certainly know the story of DC. One of our listeners wrote in saying that they'd love to see a presentation about the amendment that dealt with the direct election of senators. So that makes me think about something that I want to remind our listeners, is that you will be getting a survey about what do you think about the webinars? Are there topics we should touch that we haven't touched? Any kind of feedback that you can provide to us as we continue to plan this. It appears from my crystal ball that we're going to be operating virtually for some time now. And so the great thing about operating virtually is that our audience can be anywhere. And so one of the things that you can do to support the society is to share the invitations with your friends and neighbors across the country. We do tape record these, or not tape record, I'll tell you, I'm an old person, right? We keep a recording and they live on our website once they've been edited. And so you can come back if you had a great time at this and you think, my friend really would have loved this. There will be an opportunity for them to come and view Garrett's presentation or any of the other presentations. As always, we remind you, this is only available because of the gifts of the members and supporters of the Historical Society. We thank those of you who are members and supporters. We hope that those of you who have not yet done that will be inspired. As you saw Sam Holliday at the opening, he had that beautiful tie on. Sam, can you show us your tie for your commercial?
I certainly can.
See, for those of you who are doing Zoom things and need a tie, even though I bet you have Bermuda shorts on underneath, but we have great ties that commemorate the Capitol and are available through our website, as well as jewelry, books, ornaments made from marble from the Capitol, and we hope that you'll consider supporting us in that way. Thank you very much for being with us. Thank you, Garrett, for your time. Take care. Bye-bye.